This brief reflection is going to be on the renaissance of Syriac spirituality and theology. There's been a history within Christianity and Christendom of, on the one hand, Western Christianity, either of its Roman Catholic variety or the variations of Protestant Christianity, of assuming within this family of Western Christianity, this is where authentic, genuine, historic Christianity is embodied, and then the debates within that between theologians of an Augustine or of an Aquinas, various women, Hildegard, Macrina, Paula, and there's others who, within the West, the liturgy, the ecclesiology, and then the clashes in the 16th century between Protestantism, Luther, Reformed, Anabaptist, and the fragments of Protestant Christianity, the Roman Catholic retreating into the Trent and up to Vatican II, Tridentine Catholicism. But it's Western Christianity and the way Western Christianity tends to interpret, see itself, getting the creeds right, getting abstract ideas and shape into the degree people assent to that. They're generally in the tribe or in the clan, or they're not. And so the battle over getting theology right becomes a means of determining whether one is genuinely in the Catholic Church and the tensions within it, or what form of Protestantism. The reaction, certainly within the West, to the in-house squabbles of Western Christianity, both within Roman Catholicism, within Protestantism, and between these two forms of Christianity, interesting enough, they have a great deal in common, even though they tend to define them and emphasize the differences more than their places of commonality. But the reaction to various forms of Western Christianity, certainly in the last few decades, and it goes back earlier, has been the turn to orthodoxy. So whether Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Ethiopian Orthodoxy, various types of orthodoxy, and the historic clash between the Western Church and the Orthodox tradition, and the turn of many to the best insights of orthodoxy as embodied in the Eastern Fathers of Gregory of Nyssa, Nazianzen, Basil, John Chrysostom, and the rich liturgy of the Orthodox tradition, its vibrant history, its exquisite spirituality, the Philokalia, one of the great works of spirituality and soul formation. So these classics that emerge to us from orthodoxy have been a mother lode and a gold mine in many ways, as people have tried to say, what's the relationship then to this bigger Christendom, or this bigger Christianity, of which historically the West tended to marginalize the East, and the East could be equally firm about seeing problems of Western forms of Christianity. But the discussion largely has taken place then between variations of Western Christianity and then variations of Orthodoxy and the clashes within Orthodoxy itself over various jurisdictions. But what has been missing within this discussion often between the West and the East is the Syriac tradition, the Syriac history of spirituality and theology and liturgy, and their approach to doing Christianity and understanding Christianity. Syriac Christianity tends to see as much closer to the Semitic tradition, biblical tradition, even though often drawn into the Hellenic or the Greek tradition, lives between these poles, between the Semitic and the Hellenic. But theology for them is much more grounded in poetry, in literature, in metaphor. But why have the Syriac tradition, why has it been largely marginalized? Well, what often happened within the Syriac tradition is they were accused of being Nestorianism. One of their theologians, Theodore Mopsuiesti, was accused of buying into the Nestorian tradition. And with at the Council of Chalcedon and Ephesus and these Christological heresies, the Syriac tradition tried to argue that the categories and the conclusions reached in these particular councils and decisions in fact, did not reflect the mystery of the Christological journey itself, but because they didn't affirm the Chalcedonian position, they often were dismissed as Nestorian. And if any time someone can label one group as not fitting into the group, then we don't have to study them. And just as Origen, for example, has often been misread, caricatured by his opponents, so it's very hard to get the real Origen because he's often defined by those who opposed him and rejected him. Same with the Syriac tradition. The West, and to some degree Orthodoxy, tended to dismiss the Syriac tradition as Nestorian, anti-Chalcedonian. And so the leading thinkers within the patristic and post-patristic period of Syriac Christianity have often been marginalized, ignored, and have not been a part of that bigger Christian understanding of the faith journey. In the last few decades, largely through Sebastian Brock, but many others, I've been fortunate to stay in touch through email with Sebastian Brock. He's played a very leading role in the renaissance of Syrian Christianity. He's there's loads of texts still in Syriac and Aramaic that have yet been translated into English. And so we're in the early phase of this renaissance of Syriac Christianity, which I think will enrich and deepen and offer to people a much greater fullness of how spirituality is understood, the role of poetry as theology, metaphor as a way of seeing. I just want to linger just briefly at three thinkers here, which are essential to one of the early phases of Syriac Christianity. One is Ephraim, considered in the 4th century and often ignored in the Western, Eastern discussion. He was his work on the sort of see himself as the harp of the Lord and the strings of the soul, and allowing those strings of the soul of different desires to be played so that the music of eternity takes shape and form in time. And so Ephraim has, when one enters into his very insightful works on spirituality, biblical interpretation, the application of what it means for the soul and self-understanding, and then what that means in liturgy and church life and public witness. Ephraim is certainly comparable to any of the great fathers of the East and West, or mothers of the East and West. And with the revival of Syriac, the renaissance of Syriac spirituality, Ephraim is beginning to take front stage again. Two other thinkers which follow and in many ways stand on the shoulders of Ephraim is Nursey, a great poet, once again standing in the thick of the Syriac tradition with its metaphors, its poetry, its approach to spirituality that walks people into doing theology in a way which is deeply internalized and allows metaphors and poetry to massage the soul and the mind of the imagination. And then, of course, Joseph of Syriac is a companion to Nursey as well. And the three of them are at the foundation, in many ways, of the origins of Syriac spirituality, theology, views of the church. And as we're moving forward into history, and as people of faith are grappling with what is the fullness of Christianity within the West, within the East, the dialogue that goes on between East and West, and hopefully people are not caricaturing one another. But this third member in the Christian family, the Syriac tradition, is now in a position where there's a great renaissance of it. And I was very interested, a few years ago I did a book on Bede Griffiths, who was considered one of C.S. Lewis's best students, and actually C.S. Lewis dedicated his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, to Bede Griffiths. When Bede Griffiths left England and went to India, he settled in an area of Kerala, India, which is one of the great centers of Syriac Christianity today. And Bede Griffiths was at the center in the 1950s and 1960s of doing liturgy and learning Syriac, which was a companion language to Aramaic, a Semitic language itself. And it's interesting, in the correspondence between C.S. Lewis and Bede Griffiths, there's a lovely conversation back in the 1950s about Syriac spirituality and Syriac Christianity. And C.S. Lewis and Bede Griffiths, in that sense, are the decades ahead of their time in terms of the renaissance of Syriac spirituality. So, in conclusion, we're at a rich period of time in which the mother lode of Christianity is even being drawn forth in a fuller way. Of the Western tradition, of course, some have moved out towards the Celtic tradition, which is a wonderful opening up in the West of a fuller tradition. Also the Orthodox tradition, as a companion to sometimes the blind spots and aspects out of the Western tradition. This revival is now moving forward in a rich and meaningful way through such important Orthodox thinkers as Andrew Louth, and Timothy Ware, and many others also at the present time. So it's a vigorous tradition which is very, very much on front stage. The third, as I have mentioned, member of this bigger family, which has often been ignored, marginalized, mistreated because of caricatures of the heritage, Syriac spirituality, is now coming on front stage. I might also mention one of the reasons that Syriac Christianity has perhaps been ignored. There has been obviously the misread of it, Nestorianism and Theodore Mopsuestin's Cyril of Alexandria. But also when Islam emerged in the 7th century, there was a shutting off of that area of Christendom, and the Syriac tradition had to make sense of itself within a context of a form of aggressive Islam. And so some of the writings post-7th century within the Syriac tradition would be quite helpful for, I think, people today, particularly with the rise of Islam, is how do people of faith make sense of Christianity and Islam, and how did the Syriac tradition do that? I also mentioned there was a huge exodus of Syriac Christians from Turkey, Iraq, and Syria as a result of a certain period of time of the clash between Christianity and Islam. And a lot of them, a large diaspora, went to Kerala in India. It's one of the largest schools of Syriac Christianity right now is in Kerala in India, of which, as I mentioned earlier, B. Griffiths was for many years, wrote his first book, Christ in India, tapped into the Syriac tradition, and his friendship with C.S. Lewis was very important. And so to end, perhaps I will in time, we'll see, I can chat with Brad about this, maybe the two of us can continue, do a series on the renaissance of Syriac spirituality, and then light on some of the very significant women and men in that tradition which are coming to the fore, and how this tradition can supplement, enrich, deepen, fill out both the best of the Western Christianity, Catholic and Protestant, the best of the Orthodox, and how the Syriac tradition can inform, and the family can come together much more in a great feast as it moves forward into the future.